Before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because stories like this don't come from headlines, they come from the shadows behind them. Ron Howard has always been seen as one of Hollywood's calmest figures. A director trusted with chaos because he never raised his voice, never demanded fear, and never believed greatness required cruelty. From his childhood on television sets to his decades behind the camera, Howard built a reputation on patience and respect. But when asked about the stars who shaped his earliest understanding of Hollywood, something unexpected happened. His tone shifted, his words slowed, and the warmth he is known for faded into something heavier. These were not gossip-fueled grudges or second-hand rumors. These were realizations formed through years of reading, listening, and witnessing how the industry once protected power at any cost. Howard wasn't trying to cancel legends or rewrite film history. He was confronting something far more uncomfortable, the truth that many of Hollywood's most celebrated icons helped normalize fear, silence, and harm. What disturbed him most wasn't just individual behavior, but how the system rewarded it. The golden age looked beautiful on screen, but behind the scenes, it often thrived on intimidation. And for Ron Howard, coming to terms with that reality meant revisiting 6 legendary names that forever changed how he saw Hollywood's past. For Ron Howard, the first crack in Hollywood's fairy tale came with Errol Flynn. As a child, Howard watched Flynn's films with the same awe millions felt: bold heroes, charming smiles, and fearless confidence that felt larger than life. Flynn represented adventure and romance, the kind of movie star who made danger look glamorous. But as Howard grew older and began studying film history seriously, that image collapsed. Flynn's rise in the 1930s was explosive. Warner Bros. Built entire franchises around his charisma, presenting him as the ultimate leading man. Yet behind closed doors, his reputation told a darker story. Flynn lived without restraint, believing fame placed him above consequences. His heavy drinking, volatile temper, and reckless behavior were not secrets. They were tolerated because he made money. What unsettled Howard most was learning how early Hollywood treated excess as proof of genius. Flynn wasn't corrected, he was enabled. The studio system wrapped him in protection, smoothing scandals before they reached the public. Howard later reflected that this was his first lesson in how charm can become armor. Flynn's image wasn't just crafted for audiences, it was used to excuse behavior that would destroy others. The betrayal wasn't only Flynn's actions, but the realization that the hero he admired never truly existed the way he was sold. The moment that permanently altered Ron Howard's perception of Errol Flynn came when he studied the 1942 trial that Hollywood rarely discusses honestly. 2 women accused Flynn of serious misconduct, and the courtroom became a spectacle rather than a place for truth. Newspapers sensationalized the case, fans surrounded the courthouse chanting Flynn's name, and the studio quietly poured resources into protecting its investment. Howard was disturbed by accounts describing Flynn treating the proceedings like theater, smiling, joking, seemingly untouched by the gravity of the accusations. When Flynn was acquitted, Hollywood celebrated, framing it as proof of innocence rather than a reflection of influence. Decades later, Howard read through archived documents and private letters released long after Flynn's death. What he found was chilling. In those writings, Flynn reportedly bragged about his behavior, mocking fear and consequence. For Howard, this wasn't rumor, it was pattern. Flynn's life unraveled in predictable ways: addiction, financial ruin, and declining health. He died at just 50, officially from heart failure, but Howard believed the cause ran deeper. It was a lifestyle fueled by entitlement and protected by power. Flynn became, in Howard's mind, the blueprint for everything broken in early Hollywood, a warning of what happens when talent is allowed to eclipse accountability. If Errol Flynn represented charm hiding darkness, Kirk Douglas revealed something more complex and more disturbing to Ron Howard: the way relentless ambition can turn into domination. Douglas's life story was one Hollywood loved to celebrate. Born to immigrant parents, he fought his way up through poverty, rejection, and struggle. On screen, he embodied strength, justice, and moral courage. Films like Spartacus turned him into a symbol of resistance and leadership. But Howard discovered that the man behind those roles carried an intensity that often crossed into cruelty. Douglas was known for his volcanic temper on set. Crew members described environments charged with tension, where nothing was ever good enough and mistakes were met with humiliation. Howard wasn't shocked that Douglas was demanding. Many great artists are. What troubled him was how normalized the fear became. Douglas's anger was framed as passion. His control was framed as brilliance. Directors and actors learned to adapt rather than confront. Even Stanley Kubrick, himself famously intense, admitted Douglas was the most difficult personality he had ever tried to manage. For Howard, this wasn't a story about one difficult man. It was about an industry that rewarded intimidation as leadership. What made Kirk Douglas even harder for Ron Howard to reconcile were the stories that lingered long after the cameras stopped rolling. Whispers passed quietly through generations of Hollywood, stories of boundary-crossing behavior that was never formally addressed. These accounts were rarely spoken aloud, not because they were unknown, but because speaking carried consequences. One of the most haunting moments resurfaced decades later when Natalie Wood's sister referenced an encounter from Wood's teenage years, indirectly pointing toward Douglas. No legal case followed. No official investigation occurred. Douglas never publicly responded, yet the silence itself became part of the story. Howard later said what disturbed him most wasn't the absence of proof, but the absence of curiosity. No one wanted to know more. Douglas lived a long life, passing away at 103, celebrated for his achievements and philanthropy. But for Howard, the legacy was complicated. Douglas represented the Hollywood rule that power protects itself. His career showed how easily strength on screen could overshadow pain off it. Howard didn't accuse, he questioned. And sometimes, he believed, unanswered questions speak louder than denials ever could. Faye Dunaway taught Ron Howard that cruelty doesn't always shout, it can whisper through elegance. Dunaway was revered as one of the most powerful actresses of her generation. Her performances in Bonnie and Clyde and Chinatown were studied, praised, and immortalized. On screen, she radiated control, intelligence, and intensity. But behind the scenes, her reputation carried a very different energy. Stories from her sets painted a picture of emotional volatility, yelling, intimidation, and sudden walkouts that left entire crews paralyzed. Howard, who valued collaboration above ego, found these accounts deeply unsettling. What bothered him wasn't just Dunaway's behavior, but how frequently it was excused. Her talent became a shield. Crew members learned to brace themselves before she entered a room. Assistants feared making eye contact. Directors struggled to maintain authority. Howard later reflected that Dunaway showed him how perfectionism, when untethered from empathy, becomes destructive. She wasn't reckless like Flynn or explosive like Douglas, she was precise. And that precision made her cruelty harder to challenge. The industry labeled her difficult, but continued to hire her, reinforcing the belief that suffering was simply part of working with greatness. The stories surrounding Mommy Dearest became Hollywood folklore, but Ron Howard believed they deserved to be understood, not sensationalized. Co-stars and crew later described an atmosphere of constant tension, where emotional outbursts were routine. Director Frank Perry reportedly struggled to keep the production together, as Dunaway refused compromise on even minor details. On other projects, reports emerged of physical confrontations, verbal abuse, and days-long shutdowns caused by her demands. These weren't isolated incidents, they formed a pattern. For years, the industry tolerated it because the performances delivered awards and acclaim. But eventually, the climate changed. Younger filmmakers refused to accept fear as a creative tool. Dunaway's reputation followed her, closing doors that once stood open. She was removed from projects, including a Broadway production, and quietly sidelined. When asked years later about her legacy, Ron Howard responded without anger or judgment. He said she chased perfection so intensely that compassion became collateral damage. To him, Dunaway's story was tragic, not because she lost power, but because unchecked ego cost her connection. Talent alone, Howard believed, cannot sustain a career when humanity is left behind. No revelation shook Ron Howard more than what he learned about John Wayne. As a child, Wayne represented everything heroic, strength, honor, and moral certainty. His westerns shaped America's image of masculinity and courage. But as Howard matured and studied behind-the-scenes testimonies, that image fractured. Wayne wasn't just a star. He was an authority figure who ruled sets through intimidation. Crew members described an environment where disagreement was punished and compliance was demanded. Wayne humiliated those who challenged him and used his status to dominate both creatively and socially. Howard was disturbed by how many people shared the same memories across different films and decades. Wayne's power extended beyond temper. He openly dismissed marginalized performers, mocked indigenous actors, and resisted social change. His 1971 Playboy interview shocked Howard with its blunt defense of racist views and rejection of civil rights progress. This wasn't a private failing, it was a public stance. To Howard, Wayne symbolized how Hollywood once merged fame with ideology, allowing stars to shape culture without accountability. The hero he admired as a boy no longer existed as he once imagined. Howard's discomfort deepened when he examined John Wayne's working relationship with director John Ford, particularly during The Searchers. Ford intended the character Ethan Edwards to represent the corrosive effects of hatred and obsession. Wayne resisted that interpretation, pushing for sympathy and justification. Watching the final film decades later, Howard found the line between character and actor disturbingly thin. Wayne's personal beliefs seemed to bleed into the role, making it difficult to separate performance from worldview. Stories from extras and technicians described how Wayne's presence froze rooms. When he was angry, no one spoke. For Howard, this wasn't leadership, it was fear. Wayne's legacy remained protected for decades, shielded by nostalgia and national identity. But Howard believed confronting the truth didn't erase Wayne's cinematic impact, it contextualized it. Understanding the cost of that power mattered. Wayne wasn't simply a product of his time, he was an enforcer of it. And for Howard, that realization was painful but necessary. Roman Polanski represented the moment when Ron Howard could no longer separate art from accountability. Howard deeply admired Polanski's filmmaking craft. Rosemary's Baby and The Pianist were studied for their precision and emotional depth. But learning the full truth behind Polanski's life shattered that admiration. In 1977, Polanski was arrested and later pleaded guilty to a felony involving a 13-year-old girl. Before sentencing, he fled the United States and never returned. For Howard, this wasn't just a crime, it was a moral rupture. What followed disturbed him even more. Hollywood split. Some defended Polanski as a tortured genius, others condemned him, but many continued to work with him. Howard watched as discussions centered on awards, artistry, and legacy, while the victim faded into the background. "Talent doesn't absolve harm," Howard later said. To him, Polanski exposed how far the industry would go to protect brilliance at the expense of humanity. The moment that haunted Ron Howard most came in 2003, when Polanski won the Academy Award for The Pianist. The audience stood in applause. Howard remained seated. He later explained that he wasn't thinking about cinema. He was thinking about the victim and what that applause symbolized. Years later, when Polanski won France's César Award and protests erupted, Howard saw it as long-delayed reckoning. Accountability had taken decades, but it arrived. For Howard, Polanski's story wasn't about revenge, it was about clarity. Genius, he believed, cannot erase harm, and refusing to confront that truth only deepens the wound. Mickey Rooney broke Ron Howard's heart. As a child, Howard adored Rooney's infectious energy and joyful performances. Rooney represented innocence, laughter, and boundless optimism. But behind that smile was turmoil. Thrust into fame as a child, Rooney never had the chance to grow without pressure. He became MGM's golden boy, but the cost was enormous. Addiction, explosive temper, and emotional instability followed him into adulthood. His 8 marriages and financial disasters reflected a man who never found peace. Howard was particularly moved by accounts from Judy Garland, who hinted that Rooney's behavior contributed to her emotional pain during an already brutal studio system. The people who needed kindness most, Howard said, were often hurt by the brightest stars. Rooney's later years were marked by decline and humiliation. By the time of his death, his fortune was gone, his relationships fractured, and his legacy overshadowed by tragedy. His estate was nearly empty, and his burial was delayed due to lack of funds. For Howard, Rooney's story wasn't about villainy, it was about neglect. A system that used him, celebrated him, and then abandoned him. The smile that once lit up screens hid a lifetime of pain. And Hollywood didn't notice until it was too late. These 6 stories shattered Ron Howard's childhood vision of Hollywood, not because they erased great films, but because they revealed the cost of creating them without conscience. Power was protected. Fear was normalized. Silence was rewarded. Howard didn't share these reflections to destroy legacies, but to humanize history. Understanding the past, he believed, was the only way to build something better. Hollywood's golden age wasn't just lights and legends, it was shadows and silence. Ron Howard's honesty reminds us that admiration should never replace accountability. Which of these stories shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more untold stories from Hollywood's hidden past, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next.